People say you can't fight City Hall, and you definitely can't fight a suburban HOA with a God complex. But they've clearly never met a man with a geological surveyor's transit and a debt of honor to a ghost. My name's Elias Thorne, and until last year, I was just a guy living a quiet life in Seattle, analyzing soil samples and trying to ignore the city noise, until a single phone call from a lawyer in the high plains of Wyoming changed everything, telling me my great-uncle Silas had passed away in his sleep at 84, leaving me the one thing he'd spent his entire life refusing to sell, the Black Rock Ranch. It was 1,200 acres of absolute heaven, a place where the air tasted like pine needles and the silence was so heavy you could hear the hawks circling 300 feet up, centered around a glacial lake so blue it looked like a hole punched right through the earth into the sky. Silas was a rugged, old-school environmentalist before that was even a buzzword, a man who lived in a cabin he'd built with his own two hands and treated every acre like a cathedral, having turned down multi-million-dollar offers from resort developers for 50 years because he believed some things were too sacred to have a price tag attached to them. I drove 10 hours straight to get there, my truck loaded with camping gear and Silas's old property deeds, feeling that bittersweet ache of nostalgia as I turned off the interstate and onto the gravel road that led to the valley. But the second I crested the final ridge overlooking the lake, my heart didn't oppose. Just sink, it turned a lead in my chest. Where there should have been a pristine eastern shoreline, a place where Silas and I used to sit in total darkness to watch the elk come down to drink, there was a scar of black asphalt and a row of white stuccoed, Mediterranean-style McMansions that looked about as natural in the Wyoming wilderness as a neon sign in a monastery. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, looking at a massive three-story fortress of glass and steel sitting right on the point, a structure that I knew, deep in my marrow, based on every map Silas had ever shown me. Wasn't Oppos. Just close to our line, but was sitting squarely on our dirt. I didn't oppose to even go to the cabin first. I just drove straight toward that development, my tires crunching on expensive decorative gravel until I hit a gate with a sign that read in quote, "The Sanctuary at Azure Lake, private property, managed by the Sterling Heights HOA." End quote. A man in a crisp security uniform stepped out of a booth, looking at my mud-caked Ford like I was a rolling health hazard. And before I could even open my mouth, he told me I was lost and needed to turn around, but I just held up my ID and told him I was the owner of the ranch. He laughed a short, dry sound and told me the ranch ended 500 yards back at the fence line. But before we could get into it, a white Range Rover pulled up and a woman stepped out who looked like she'd been carved out of expensive soap. Perfect blonde bob, a tennis outfit that cost more than my truck, and a smile that felt like a cold razor blade against my skin. This was Brenda Sterling, the founder of the development and the president of the HOA, and she looked at me with this patronizing pity, telling me, in quote, "Oh, you must be the nephew. Listen, honey, Silas was a sweet man, but he was a bit confused in his final years. He sold us this easement back in 2021. So if you're looking for a handout or a place to camp, you're in the wrong zip code." End quote. I just stared at her, my mind racing through the meticulous files Silas kept, because I knew for a fact the man would have rather set his own arm on fire than sell an inch of that shoreline. I told her, in quote, "My uncle didn't oppose. Sell easements, Brenda. He sold minerals and cattle, and if you got a house on that point, you're trespassing on 1,200 acres of private legacy." End quote. Her smile didn't oppose. Just fade. It vanished, replaced by a look of such sheer, aristocratic entitlement it made my blood boil as she leaned in and whispered, in quote, "We have 42 families here who have invested their life savings into this dream. We have the county permits, we have the signed surveys, and we have more lawyers than you have teeth. So why don't an oppose? Till you go back to your dusty little cabin and play cowboy before I have you arrested for harassing my residents." End quote. I went back to Silas and Oppos as cabin that night, and let me tell you, I didn't oppose. Sleep a wink. I just sat at his old oak table under the light of a kerosene lamp, spreading out the original 1948 land grant and the topographical surveys he'd updated every decade like clockwork. Being a geologist, ISN and Oppos. Just about rocks and Oppos. S about the geometry of the earth, it and Oppos. S about understanding that the ground doesn't and Oppos. Lie even when people do, And as I cross-referenced the GPS coordinates on my professional handheld unit with the old stone Karen Silas had built along the ridge, the math started screaming at me. Brenda had an oppos. T just overstepped by a few feet. She'd moved the entire eastern boundary line nearly 400 yards to the west, effectively in quote, stealing in quote, about 22 acres of the most valuable waterfront property in the state, and she'd done it with such surgical precision that unless you knew exactly where the subterranean limestone shelf ended, you'd never catch the shift. The next morning, I was out there at dawn with my surveying equipment, wearing my orange vest and looking like just another contractor. And that's when I found the in quote, proof in quote, brand new professionally installed survey pins that were stamped with a firm called in quote, Peak Horizon Consulting, end quote. I did a quick search on my phone while standing in the brush, and my stomach did a slow roll when I saw that Peak Horizon was a subsidiary of a larger holding company owned by Brenda's husband, Marcus Sterling, and the end quote, independent end quote. Surveyor who signed off on the permits was a guy named Dave Miller, who happened to be the sitting county commissioner for the district. It was a closed loop, a perfect little ecosystem of corruption where the developer bought the survey from her husband, and the husband's friend at the county office stamped the paper, and they all just assumed the old man in the cabin was too tired and too alone to ever look at a map. I decided right then that I wasn't an oppos. T gonna yell, I was an oppos. T gonna make threats. I was gonna be as quiet and as patient as the erosion that carved the canyon. So I spent the next 3 weeks playing the part of the grieving, defeated nephew, even waving at Brenda when she drove past in her Range Rover, while I was secretly coordinating with an old college friend of mine who specialized in forensic title law. We started digging, and what we found was a masterpiece of white-collar rot. They had an oppos. T just moved my line. They'd done it to 3 other neighboring properties over the last 5 years, targeting elderly owners or out-of-state heirs who didn't an oppos. T know the difference between a section line and a fence post. But Brenda's biggest mistake was her arrogance. She was so sure she'd won that she started building a massive, in quote, community beach club, in quote, right on the spot where Silas's favorite fishing pier used to be, pouring a concrete slab that was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. The turning point came when I received an anonymous envelope in Silas's mailbox. No return address, just a thumb drive inside that contained a recorded Zoom meeting of the HOA board from 6 months prior, and watching it was like seeing a villain monologue in a movie. There was Brenda, sitting at the head of a mahogany table, laughing as she told the board members, in quote, Don and oppos. T worry about the old man at BlackRock. He hasn't an oppos. T filed a tax protest in 10 years. He probably doesn't an oppos. T even know where his boots are, much less his deed. We'll move the pins, file the into oppos. Correction in oppos, with Dave at the county, and by the time anyone notices, the concrete will be dry and the statute of limitations will be our best friend. End quote. Hearing her talk about Silas like he was a senile nuisance instead of the man who'd protected that valley for decades snapped something inside me, and I realized that being, end quote, nice and quote, was over, so I authorized my lawyer to file a quiet title action and a massive injunction, but I didn't in oppos. T serve it on her at her office. I waited for the grand opening of the beach club. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The whole, in quote, sanctuary, in quote, community was there, ladies in sundresses, guys in loafers, a catering crew serving mimosas on that illegal concrete slab, and Brenda was standing at a podium with a pair of oversized golden scissors, ready to cut the ribbon. I walked up the beach, still in my work boots and grease-stained jeans, and as the crowd went quiet, Brenda looked at me with this performative sympathy and said, and quote, Elias, how nice of you to join us, but this is a private event for members only, so if you could just step back on it, yo. You are, whatever is left of your land, we'd appreciate it. End quote. I just smiled, the first real smile I'd had in a month, and I pulled out a megaphone I'd brought in my backpack because I wanted every single one of those residents to hear what was coming next. End quote. I'm not here for the mimosas, Brenda, end quote. I said, my voice echoing off the glass of her mansion, end quote. I'm here to inform you that as of 9 a.m. this morning, the State District Court has issued a mandatory stay on all activities on this parcel. And more importantly, I filed a criminal complaint with the Attorney General's Office for land title fraud and racketeering. End quote. The crowd started murmuring, and Brenda tried to laugh it off, telling everyone I was just a disgruntled relative, but then my friend the lawyer stepped out of the crowd. He'd bought a guest pass from a disgruntled resident and handed her a thick stack of papers. End quote. This is a copy of the original 1948 survey, the one your husband's company conveniently and oppose, lost and oppose. And this is a report from a third-party state surveyor confirming that every single person standing on this patio is currently trespassing on the Black Rock Ranch. End quote. The look on her face wasn't oppose, just anger. It was a weird kind of glitching terror like she couldn't and oppose. Compute that the end quote, cowboy end quote, had actually done the homework, and as the residents started looking at their own feet like the ground was turning into lava, I told them, end quote, I don and oppose. Have a problem with you people. I have a problem with the woman who lied to you. She sold you and oppose. The sanctuary and oppose. On land she didn't and oppose. Own. And if I were you, I'd be calling my title insurance company right now because this beach club, it's getting jackhammered on Monday morning, end quote. The fallout was like a nuclear explosion in a small town. The county commissioner, Dave Miller, resigned within 48 hours once the attorney general started looking at his signature on those end quote, corrected end quote, surveys, and Brenda's husband's company was hit with a forensic audit that revealed a decade of similar land grabs across 3 counties. Brenda tried to fight it. She spent 6 months throwing every legal hurdle at me, trying to bankrupt me with discovery motions. But I had Silas's mineral rights money and a burning sense of purpose. And eventually, the evidence was so overwhelming that the HOA board turned on her to save themselves. They realized that if they didn't in oppose, settle with me, I could legally petition to have every house on that eastern line demolished. And while I'm not a monster, I didn't in oppose. Want to see families lose their homes because of one woman's greed. I wasn't in oppose. Going to let her win either. We ended up reaching a settlement that was the ultimate poetic justice. I didn't in oppose. Take their money. I took the land back, plus a 50-yard buffer zone that effectively cut the development off from the lake, and the HOA had to pay for the complete removal of the beach club and the restoration of the shoreline to its natural state. As for the mansion, it turns out Brenda had financed the whole thing against the projected HOA fees of a development that was now legally radioactive, and when the bank realized the house was built on a disputed title, they pulled the rug out from under her, and she lost everything in a foreclosure that was the talk of the county for a year. Now, I sit on Silas's porch in the evenings, looking down at a shoreline that's finally starting to grow back. The concrete is gone. The end quote, private property end quote. Signs have been replaced by a conservation easement I signed that ensures this lake will stay wild forever, and the silence has finally returned. But makes you wonder, doesn't it oppose? It? How many people out there are living on a end quote, sanctuary end quote, that was stolen from someone who was too old or too tired to fight back? How many Brendas are running your local boards, moving the pins when no one is looking and calling it end quote, progress end quote? I'm curious what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have taken the multi-million-dollar settlement they offer me halfway through the trial to just go away and let them keep the land? Or is there a point where the dirt under your fingernails is worth more than any check they could ever write? Drop a comment and tell me if you think I was too harsh on the residents who were just end quote, innocent bystanders end quote, or if they were complicit for not asking questions when a end quote, sanctuary end quote, appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a protected wilderness. I'll be here, watching the elk come back to the water, and I think Silas would finally be able to get some sleep.